Hey, I'm Rob. Welcome to Hobby Phase, part of the 5th Trooper Network. In this video, we're going to be going back to the Rebel starter set and building my childhood hero, Luke Skywalker. We're going to go a little bit extra on some of the basing, try and make him have a bit more presence on the field. I've been thinking a lot of it in gaming recently. In other miniatures games, often our heroes are on larger bases. We don't have that in Legion, so I've wondered how we can make our hero have that little bit more presence. The model went together absolutely no bother at all. Honestly, it took a few minutes, really straightforward. As always, I clip it off the sprue, shave down any extra little mould lines, and then pop it together with some Tamiya extra thin glue. The Tamiya extra thin works by melting the plastics together so you get a really solid bond, which you wouldn't if you were using super glue or similar. I'm going to start off by priming in brown, just because I think if any parts are showing through our painting, then that will look the most natural. I then do a quick zenithal from above in white, and then I'm going to go over that with a little bit of yellow also through the airbrush, just to get us started on that jacket. The jacket is one of the big features, I guess, of this model. It's going to really stand out on the board. I did a little toing and froing with how I painted the jacket, so I started off with this sulphuric yellow by P3, and it looked a little washed out to me, having, highlighted up. So I came back at them with some Yriel yellow from Games Workshop, and highlighted towards the top of the jacket. I'm trying to keep my highlights quite thin, quite smooth and quite clear here, so I've got nice crispy blends. And then to shade it, I've decided to shade it with a little bit of brown. And I'm using some burnt umber from Vallejo Air. And all I'm doing here is carefully, I guess, black lining, only I'm doing it in burnt umber, all the parts of the jacket. So I've thinned the paint right down so it flows really nicely just into all the cracks and crevices on the jacket. I then put that same paint into the airbrush and I just gently spray in any shadows I want. Gives me a really nice bit of saturation. And I come back in with the Yriel yellow, thin down again, and re-establish some of those highlights. My highlights are always facing the top of the model, or sort of upward facing planes on the model. And then back in with the sulphuric yellow, where it was a bit stark and a bit bright before. It actually looks really good as a second highlight. And then to finish it off, I mix that sulphuric yellow with a little bit of greenish white from AK. Just a little here, and I've used a greenish white rather than a normal white, just to add a little bit of contrast and a little bit of interest. Although if I'm honest, I'm not sure it made much difference. And here I'm highlighting the smallest areas. Painting his face did give me a few issues. This was actually my second go at doing it. And I started off with some of this Midlund Flesh from P3 just to give us a nice established base coat, mixing it in with some of that burnt umber simply because I had it on the palette and it gave me a nice darker tone to start with. And I'm going to paint all over the face with that. As I've got that paint out on the palette, I decided just to quickly do his hair just so we can see the contrast. And then I'm going to do his eyes next, as always. And I'm going to base them in the greenish white from AK. I keep my brush with as sharp a point as I can here. Breath out, steady hands, and just dot the whites into his eyes. And then I just use a blue paint to dot in his pupils. Again, keeping the brush as sharp as possible. You can see I just tune it on the back of my thumb there. Where I have gone over his eyelids and stuff with the greenish white, I just go back in with our Midlund Flesh and burnt umber mix just to, carve out his eyes again. and then I do my trick of dotting a little Reikland Flesh into the corners of his eyes and his eyelids, just to really establish where his eyes are. I'm then coming in with the pure Midlund Flesh from P3 as our first sort of stage highlight. And I keep this very thin, so as I work it can give us a nice smooth transition. We're not left with any sharp lines. This face took me a long time to paint, and I did do a little bit more off camera. I'm okay with how it turned out. I think I can do better. Then for my final highlight, I'm going to use some pale skin from scale 75. And again, I'm thinning it right down, with probably 50-50 with water here, so I can get nice smooth transitions on the parts of his face I want the brightest. And I use a little bit of dirty red from AK. I felt his face looked a little lifeless, so I used a little of this dirty red just around the edges of the face, on his lips and his cheeks a little bit, just to sort of suggest there's some blood flow there and make the flesh look a little bit more alive. The shirt was quite straightforward. I based it in some black from AK. Technically, I should probably have painted the shirt before the jacket, as if any of that black gets on the jacket, it's going to be a real pain to clear up. However, I knew I wanted to use the airbrush for some of the highlighting, and that order of operations doesn't work properly together. Once I'm done with the black, I highlight up through some Tenebrous grey, and then a mix of Tenebrous grey with the greenish white. Remembering we want this to look dark, so our highlights should be very small here, especially when we get to this stage with the brighter grey. I suppose it's still quite a dark grey, but it's a brighter grey. You can see I'm keeping my highlights very small, very restrained here, and mostly I'm stippling them in to suggest that it's a cloth textured material. And then I do go in with the tiniest bit of pure greenish white just to really establish some of those shapes and make them readable when we're playing with him on the tabletop. Hair was very straightforward. We used some of the desert yellow from Army Painter. It's a great base colour for sort of dirty blonde hair. Well, I say base colour, we're using it over the burnt umber we'd already put on. And then I highlight that up with some ice yellow from AK. I try not to highlight every single strand of hair individually. Instead, again, I'm thinking of how the light would be hitting him from above and concentrating my highlights in those areas. I then realised parts of his jacket are a different colour to the rest, so I just did this very quickly with some Vampiric Flesh to give it a sort of suede-y look, I think. Suede-y? Suede-y a word? Looks like it's made of suede. I'm going with suede-y. I did a first highlight on it with some of the ice yellow simply because it was on the palette. Again, very thinned down to keep our transitions smooth. And then did a quick final highlight with that greenish white again. Small highlights, and also tried to edge highlight with it just to make the model more readable again when we're playing in game, so we should be, able to see the shapes of the model from a distance. You can also see I've painted his boots here. I did them the same as I did his shirt, so no point in showing that. Moving on to the trousers, they're brown in canon, so we're going to paint them brown, and I decided to use Burnt Umber from AK this time. It's a different shade of brown, slightly less saturated than the previous Burnt Umber we used elsewhere on the model, and I like that for the trousers. So I'm just base coating in that. And then we're going to do some quick and rough highlights, mixing the Burnt Umber in with the Vampiric Flesh. Again, we've got all these colours on the palette, we might as well use them. I'm keeping my highlights quite small, quite controlled. I'm not super bothered about them being really smooth. It is a material, so again, if we can see a few dots and scratches and things like that, it tends to look more real to our eye. Final highlight of just the Vampiric Flesh, again thinned right down. That will help with the blends. And you can see how small I'm keeping these final highlights. And I paint the side of his trousers basically the same as I did the jacket, with a couple of different shades of yellow and some of the Burnt Umber to shade it. In fact, a lot of the Burnt Umber was on there anyway from messy painting earlier. Where I'd put maybe a little too much of the ice yellow on and I thought it looked a little wiped out, I've thinned down the Yriel yellow to a glaze consistency, and I'll just run that over the whole of that stripe on the side of his trousers, just to sort of filter it and stain it down to be a slightly more saturated yellow colour. And then I decide to blackline those just to neaten them up and make them stand out a little more, mixing the black in with some Burnt Umber. Again, keeping my brush as sharp as I can, and you'll see I often do that on the back of my thumb just before I attempt a clean line. For all the leather parts, I used the same method, and that was to base coat them in saddle brown first, which is a sort of reddish brown from AK. Then I'm going to highlight this up with loads of dots and scratches and stuff, being as imperfect as possible with the ice yellow. And when I'm doing these, I'm concentrating the scratches in two places. One is where I think they would be more worn. It is leather, it does show when it's worn. And the other is where I want the highlights to be. So you can see on his thigh, I've highlighted it in the same place as the trousers to make the model read consistently. And at the moment, it looks too stark by far, that contrast between those two colours. So I use some Snakebite leather, and it's thinned down quite a lot with water that's just in the brush, and I glaze that over, and that will sort of smooth the transitions and make it look, it gives it a really nice natural leather look, especially when we matte varnish it later. I've done the lightsaber hilt in the same way you've seen me do other lightsaber hilts, so I base coat it in black, and then I'm going to use some dark Prussian blue, probably covering 3/4, maybe even more of the black parts. Highlight that up with some blue grey again from AK. At this point I have to start being really controlled because I don't want to just dump it everywhere. But we are covering a good chunk of what we've painted, but we do want black and blue in the recesses to suggest that sort of cold shiny metal. Right, moving on to the base. So my friend Juicy was over the other night, and we shared a bottle of champagne together, and I thought what fitting way to use the cork than in the Hero of the Rebellion's base. So my first step is to sort of measure it for the height I want the model to be, and then start carving some shapes out. Do be careful when you're doing this sort of thing. It is quite easy for the craft knife to go astray. And all throughout you can see obviously I've done this before I've painted the model because I don't want to be handling the model too much. I'm wanting this to look like rock, so once I've got it in a very rough shape of how I want it, I just tear it with my clippers. I'm sort of yanking chunks out in a very uneven fashion because I think that'll make it look more realistic. We can see it's beginning to take shape. You can probably see what I'm starting to go for here. The outside of the rock, well, champagne cork at the moment, looks wrong, so just hit that with some sanding paper until it's the shape I want it to be, and then super glue it to the base. And get a few of the little offcuts of a few of the little offcuts of the cork, and start popping them sort of all over the place, again to sort of add texture and make it look uneven. Then I have this box of, I don't know what it is, some kind of gravel I once picked up at a model train shop. I've had it for years. And I just chuck the whole thing in there, and then any spare super glue that it's about, they'll stick to and make it really hard and start giving me loads of texture. Here is the perfect tool for when you're doing any miniature modelling, which is a power drill. So do be careful if you do that. You could probably use a hand drill, but I was feeling lazy. And I've kept the, I don't know what you call it, the sort of protecting tube from a paintbrush I own. And we're going to use this to make a water spout to make it look like water's pouring out of the rock here. Really handy, those little tubes that come around paintbrushes. So do hold on to those. And then I've got some ink, I think it's, I don't even know where that's from, it's just come out my bit box and it looks a bit technical, so I've put that next to the tubes just to make it feel a little bit sci-fi. We don't want our bases to look too sort of old world. Then I go a little off-piste with the painting here. I want to get loads of colour into the base, although we're going to cover up 90% of it. So I primed it brown, and then I start hitting it with some blues and greens, and even a bit of magenta through the airbrush, just to add in a bit of tonality to the base. Although I mess this up in a minute and cover up nearly all of it anyway, so a largely pointless endeavour. My next step is to get some of that Vampiric Flesh, and we're just going to dry brush the whole thing. Now pick out all the details, it'll start giving us contrast, starts making it readable again. At this point I'm really happy with how it looks. I actually really like those purples and blues in the recess. I'll do another highlight with some greenish white, sorry not highlight, another dry brush, but very minimal this time. And then over the top I dumped some Agrax Earthshade and Anthonian Camoshade, they are awkward words to say, and just sort of dump them all over the rock, but it maybe looked a bit too bright, so I did a second go of that and it got rid of a lot of those colours we put in earlier, which was a shame because I was liking how they looked. I've put some tubes in connecting to our pipe. I'm going to be really lazy about painting them, base coat them yellow and then just dump some yellow contrast over them. It'll look fine. It's the bottom of the base, it's not a focus. We are going to do a water effect on here. So we're going to do a quick rough wet blend on the base using some dark Prussian blue and Adriatic blue. Not bothered about this blend being neat, we're going to cover up most of it. And I want to make sure that outside of it is painted black to suggest, you know, a void. And here, yeah, I'm happy with the composition of that model, I think it looks cool. We're doing the water effect last because I want to matte varnish the model, and obviously if I matte varnish a water effect it'll look really rubbish. So our next step is to start putting tufts all over the top of the base. I've got a couple of different sizes here, though I don't like the look of the flowers, I didn't use them in the end. So I just dipped them in some glue and then popped them on. I've also got some of this long grass, again I got it from a model train shop. And what I do with that is just bunch it together carefully, dip it in some super glue, and then touch that onto the back of the model. And I'm wanting to put that around the back of Luke to frame him so that we know where our eye is meant to look. It did look a bit long and a bit unnatural, so I sort of pushed it around and messed around with it. I accidentally set a light to it at one point as well, which made it look incredibly realistic. Right, our water effect. I've kept some packaging, I think it is from a tufts box, and I'm just going to glue that on under our spout and onto our base there. What we're going to carefully do is just drip some UV resin down that and then immediately hit it with the torch I do that like twice, and then I do the UV resin all over the rest of the base. And it makes that packaging sort of disappear. It makes it look like the water's just pouring out the spout. Pretty happy with that. And then once that's fully cured, I just stick it outside in the sun for 5 minutes. I'm going to put on some transparent water texture from Vallejo all over the base. Our last step is to do the lightsaber blade. I've been looking at lightsabers I've painted recently and maybe haven't been super happy with them, so I've decided to try a different approach today. The issue is, on screen, the lightsaber is nearly white and the colour emits from it. But obviously we can't do that completely with a model, so what I've decided to do is base coat the whole thing in the Adriatic blue. Right at the base I'm going to put my most saturated colour, and at the tip, and in the centre I'm going to paint the white in an attempt to make it look like that's where the light is emitting from. And also, because we're sort of controlling the viewing angle of this model a little with our long grass and the pose of our model, we can be more considered with where our highlight is, because we know mostly where people are going to be looking at the model from. And I stipple it on this time rather than trying to make it smooth to suggest it's sort of crackling a little, and then thin down some of that Adriatic blue and just smooth out the roughest parts at either end of the white there. And that's us done. Luke, I'm really happy with him. He's the hero of the rebellion and my childhood hero, really. If you enjoy what we're doing on the 5th Trooper, do consider subscribing, joining our Patreon. All the links are in the description below. If you'd like to see more hobby content like this or have any other suggestions for what you'd like, please do put them in the comments below.